Once the ancestral tree of all things appeared, Duangsu disappeared, releasing our boy's body. Jiang fell on his butt to the ground, and his attention fixed on the tree. He was confused since he didn't know why he was in the sea of consciousness. He remembered being possessed by the ancient god. Many questions came to his mind as he didn't know what was happening. The fruit began to shine intensely, catching Jiang's attention. He couldn't believe that the ancestral tree of all things was bearing fruit again. This fruit was different from the previous ones. Jiang stood up and started observing the fruit with a curious gaze. He knew that with the current level of the ancestral tree, it wasn't possible for it to bear colorful fruits. Then a system window appeared. Currently, the fruit wasn't ripe. It was a fruit formed by an extremely powerful divine soul as its embryo. It contained the source of divinity of that soul. For the fruit to mature successfully, he had to water it regularly with divine souls. Jiang put his hand under his chin and his eyes filled with joy, making a smile appear on his face, as this fruit contained the divine soul of the ancient god. Duangsu wanted to take over Jiang's body and did not expect the ancestral tree to form a fruit with his soul. Although the tree could not block the curse, it was still powerful when it came to divine souls and divine consciousness. The only bad thing about the fruit was that Jiang had to water it regularly with the divine souls of living beings, a condition too strict. While he was distracted, a familiar voice caught his attention, asking if he had awakened. Jiang came out of his trance and his mind filled with confusion, not knowing what was happening. Once our boy turned around, his eyes widened in surprise at what was in front of him. There was a powerful giant dragon with the shape of a six-eyed bat, and on top of its head sat Xiaojia. With a casual voice, he revealed to his father that he had managed to tame this monster. Jiang's attention fixed on the dragon, leaving him paralyzed with fear. Taming the dragon, Xiaojia approached his father, began observing him, and asked if his new pet wasn't imposing. Jiang couldn't help but step back in shock, realizing that these creatures belonged to the Sea of Consciousness. He couldn't believe that little Jia was riding a 9 transformations creature. These were beings that not even the great Jialinku had been able to tame back then. Our boy stood speechless without knowing what was happening. The sky was filled with beetles, which had tamed the fiercest creatures of the Sea of Consciousness. Jiang was unable to believe that little Xiaojia had been able to tame so many monsters. Placing his hand on the dragon's neck, Xiaojia got off it, grabbed Jiang by the arm, and with a serious expression explained that this pet was very docile, and although little Nine wouldn't like it, he was sure his father would. He wanted him to ride the dragon. Jiang began observing Xiaojia and couldn't help but go on alert, not knowing if little Xiaojia really was capable of controlling the dragon. At the end, Xiaojia convinced Jiang and both mounted on the head of the dragon. Despite our boy being somewhat scared, Xiaojia placed both hands on its head and gave the order to fly. The powerful dragon raised its head, and Jiang explained that this monster was called Dark Demon. According to what he remembered, Eternal Hell had many of these monsters that were naturally forbidden by the human race. Calmly, Xiaojia explained that one only needed to mark this beast with a seal, and it could be used as a mount. Jiang was somewhat surprised since he knew that a 9 transformation monster would be very useful. The dragon spread its wings and prepared to fly. Just then, Xiaojia's mind filled with confusion. He was not very sure if this thing could be taken outside. Jiang, who was behind him, mentioned that if they took the dragon out of the corpse, it would not take long before it was eliminated by the path of heaven. According to what he knew, this creature should only exist in the depths of eternal hell. He did not expect that it would also be born in the sea of consciousness of the ancient god. With a lost look, Jiang thought it was a shame since they could not expose this beast for too long. And although there wasn't much time left, at critical moments this beast could be very helpful. Jiang's eyes filled with surprise. He began to imagine a powerful serpent and remembered that there should still be 5 more monsters like the Dark Demon. He didn't know why he couldn't see them anywhere. Upon hearing this, little Xiaojia couldn't help but get nervous and sweat. With a sincere expression, Xiaojia revealed that he had eaten the other creatures. This left both the dragon and Jiang confused. He remembered that his son had filled his stomach with the heart of the ancient god. Little Xiaojia casually responded that he was hungry since he had reproduced again. Jiang couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed. He placed one hand over his face and rested the other on Xiaojia's shoulder, thinking that he had done what needed to be done. He decided to leave this place to find peace. Xiaojia began observing his father with a confused expression. Jiang got off the dragon and started crying, realizing that his son was only wasting fortune. He decided to look at things from a positive perspective. At least one monster was still alive. As a human being, he should be grateful. The attention of the dragon and Xiaojia was fixed on Jiang. His son could not help but fall into confusion upon seeing his behavior. Just then, loud knocks began to be heard coming from the door. Jiang's gaze fixed on the door, realizing it was Gu Kaishan. The divine soul of the ancient god was sealed, and now that the dark demon had been captured, he knew that the outer defense would soon disappear. Sensing his master's energy, Jiang realized that the Jai family would also arrive soon. He turned to Xiao Jia and with a serene expression gave him the order to make the insects devour everything quickly and pack up what remained to take away. They needed to retreat soon, so he urged him to hurry. Xiao Jia began to observe his father in silence, not knowing why he was in such a hurry. He started touching his chin with his finger, and his eyes filled with sadness since he could no longer eat, asking if he could eat next time. Jiang refused, explaining that this was not a restaurant but the treasure of a god. Jiang's eyes filled with seriousness. He began to imagine Zai Xuanyu's powerful great-grandfather exuding an overwhelming energy. He knew that the reason Jai Lingku had not been able to become the god of the 9 transformations sword was not disconnected from the opportunities present in this place, realizing that if that person entered here and discovered what had happened, it would cause a great commotion. Using his power, little Xiao Jia began to drain and compress the food that the insects couldn't devour, turning it into a ball of water. The only bad thing was that he couldn't store it. Jiang turned around and told him not to worry since his sister was going to take care of that. Little Nine manifested herself, and upon seeing this, her eyes filled with fury, making her sweat. In front of her was a pile of giant balls made of water. She put her hands on her hips and her attention fixed on them. For her, these balls were nothing more than foul-smelling dung. She could no longer tolerate her brother because he wouldn't stop causing problems. With a smile, Jiang began flying toward the exit. Now that little Nine had cleaned up all the mess, it was time to return and call the master. Outside the tomb, Gu Kaishan attacked again and this time cut the corpse's wall, creating an opening. He began to observe carefully and mentioned that the wound was not healing. Upon hearing this, Jai Lingku's attention focused on the wound. He couldn't help but be surprised to see that not only had the defense of the ancient god's corpse weakened, but it even seemed like it was about to disappear. The gaze of Gu Kaishan, who had his arms crossed, filled with joy. He wanted to go in and save Jiang Chen. Jai Lingku's eyes widened with curiosity. He was suspicious and wanted to go in as well to see what had happened. Just before they could act, Jiang Chen appeared flying. He reached out his hand toward his master and with a desperate expression asked him to take him along. Gu Kaishan and Jai Lingku began observing him silently, not knowing what was happening. Once Jiang came out of the corpse, Zai Xuanyu came running and gave him a strong hug. She couldn't help but cry and feel relieved to see that he was okay. The eyes of our boy widened in surprise. Despite feeling relieved, he knew this was not the moment. Gu Kaishan, who was next to him, couldn't help but feel an inner peace upon seeing that Jiang was fine. Quickly, Jiang pushed her aside with his hand, and with a furious expression gave her the order to leave since there was no time. Upon seeing this, Zai Xuanyu's eyes filled with tears and her mind was full of confusion. She did not know what was happening to Jiang and why he said there was no time. Jiang approached Gu Kaishan and with a serious gaze explained to his master that if they did not leave this place quickly, they were going to die. Upon hearing this, his attention focused on him and he could not help but go on alert, without knowing why Jiang was so serious. Despite being unsure, he decided to trust his disciple. Both mounted on the blade of his sword. Using his fingers, he began to control his sword, making it shoot out like lightning. He said goodbye to them, explaining that he no longer wanted to stay in this place. Seeing this, Zai Xuanyu couldn't help but feel sad, thinking that Jiang hated her, while on the other hand, her father was furious. He started shouting, thinking that he had given the divine and demonic blood in vain to someone who didn't understand how to take care of a lady. Zai Xuanyu clenched her fists, approached her father, and with a furious look asked how he could insult Jiang, reminding him that Jiang had risked his life to save her. The father closed his eyes, put his hand behind his head, and couldn't help but feel somewhat embarrassed, thinking that if Jiang had risked his life for his daughter, it meant she was important to him. She placed her hands over her mouth and couldn't help but blush at the thought of Jiang. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized that to Jiang she was important and he was afraid this might affect her performance during the competition of the prodigies of heaven. For this reason, he had risked his life. She placed her hands on her hips and filled herself with determination, vowing not to disappoint Jiang in the fight for the list of prodigies, promising to show her best version. Upon seeing this, the father couldn't help but feel happy. Not far from them was Jai Lingku, his attention fixed on the tomb of the ancient god. He felt suspicious and knew that Jiang Chen's reaction had not been natural, thinking it would be better to go in to see what had happened. He began to carefully observe the interior of the corpse, and it didn't take long for him to realize that all the treasure had disappeared. He remembered that before there were a lot of monsters in the sea of consciousness of the corpse, but now there wasn't a single one left. He put his hand on top of his head, closed his eyes, and started imagining Jiang and Gu Kaishan fleeing on the sword. He knew Jiang was guilty since he was eager to leave. He was furious because Jiang hadn't left even a single monster for him. When Jai Linkyu had entered the corpse, he had faced the 5 powerful beasts. Not even he knew how Jiang had been able to escape from the level 9 monsters, something that had even been complicated for someone as strong as him. He entered the corpse and began to inspect the veins carefully. He knew that Jiang was not someone simple. Despite our boy having left him a bitter future, he was willing to accept it. But what Jiang did not know is that he had completely underestimated his power. While the master and disciple were riding on the sword, Gu Kaishan turned around and asked if Jiang had really emptied the sword god's treasure. Our boy put his hand behind his head and replied yes. Gu Kaishan could not help but feel somewhat disappointed, not knowing what kind of dog disciples he had accepted. He had always been honest and obedient, but his disciples were something else. The first had proclaimed himself as the king of the bloody knife back then, causing total chaos in the Kingland war zone. The second had stolen the National Guardian's fiancé, and now the third was even harder for him to describe. With a cheerful expression, Jiang extended his hands and recalled that only 3 days remained before the prodigy ranking competition began, asking if he believed that with his current power he could win in a battle against Jiang Wuxuang and Jai Xuanyu. Gu Kaishan turned around and began observing him silently without responding. He explained that this time it seemed like he would not have many problems if he fought against Jai Xuanyu. He had heard that these days in Magic City Jiang Wuxuan had also progressed greatly, and his 8-armed god of war body was something not to be underestimated. Somewhere else was Ying Jian training on the Red Lake. He was not only the first celestial genius of Jiang's generation, but also his talent was considered the best in 800 years of Dazia. While Ying Jian's body was surrounded by a powerful energy, he began to gaze at his hand with a piercing expression. Generally, job changers reach spiritual maturity at 18 years old to be able to activate a professional class. But Ying Jian was different. He had activated his professional class at 3 years old, obtaining recognition from the divine weapon, the human emperor's sword, at 9 years old. Next to him were several powerful red dragons. At 12 years old, he had entered a forbidden zone and returned at 15. During these last 3 years, he had been training in seclusion in the military region of the capital. Jiang knew that Ying Jian had awakened a class very early, but he didn't know why his current level barely reached the 3 transformations. Gu Kaishan explained that this was because, in addition to the system, he also cultivated the supreme techniques of all celestial races, leaving our boy in shock. Using his hand, Ying Jian wiped his chin, his eyes filled with curiosity. His body of murderous blood was about to be completed, and he wanted to know if there was news about Jiang Chen. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.